Welcome back, everybody, to GCSE Religious Studies. In this lesson, we're going to move on away from looking at the sort of theological practices in terms of, or at least the theological doctrines around Christianity, and we're going to actually move on to talk about Christian practices. So there's going to be a series of lessons focusing on things relating to celebrations, to worship, to sacraments, etc., etc. And we're going to begin by talking about worship in this lesson, the different kinds of worship, the different aspects of worship, and the significance of different types of worship as well. So, like I've said, this is the first lesson looking at a series of aspects relating to the practices within Christianity. And we spent a good amount of time in the last few lessons focusing on theological beliefs and concepts within Christianity. Now, while this is a separate chapter within the specification and a separate topic, you should still be very reticent of the fact that you can refer back to the lessons that we've done previously looking at the different theological doctrines of Christianity, and you can draw connections and distinctions between all of these different things. So we can talk about the significance of certain Christian practices as a result of certain Christian beliefs and doctrines. So we should really be focusing on the previous chapter as well as this chapter when we actually examine these different practices. So let's talk about the importance of worship within Christianity. Now, worship is essentially, as a definition, just the act of praising or showing some kind of devotion or love to a deity, specifically in this instance to God. And so worship is something that can be done in many different ways, and it takes many different forms. Now, when we look at different Islamic practices when it comes to worship, we will examine the differences in that particular theological setting. But from this perspective, we can look at the different forms within Christianity. And there are two broad types of worship within Christianity. And these are the two broad types of worship that take place within congregations. So within the formal setting of a particular church practice, for example. So the first is known as liturgical worship, and the second is non-liturgical worship. So very simple, very easy to understand. Okay, one is liturgical, one is non-liturgical. And these are the main types of worship that we're going to spend the most of this lesson looking at, but then there are other types of worship as well that we have to examine. So we have to also talk about, for example, charismatic worship, as well as individual worship, and the importance of worshipping individually. So let's begin with liturgical worship. This is a very structured form of worship within a congregation setting. So what happens within a liturgical setting is the congregation, which is just simply the group who is part of this worship, they will be led by those who are leading a service, whether that be a particular person who is chosen on the day to lead the service, or somebody who is actually professionally leading services, like a vicar, for example, and they will use certain patterns for the service. There will be a general template structure for how each of the services take place. These are done the same every time that particular service is conducted. And so it's a very structured and it's a very formal type of worship. And it is something that takes place repeatedly across different services. Depending on which service we're talking about, they will conduct that service again and again the same way each time. So we often see liturgical worships within, for example, Roman Catholic traditional churches, within Orthodox churches, whether that be Greek Orthodox or even Eastern Orthodox, as well as within the Church of England as well. So a very broad amount of different Christian denominations will opt to use liturgical worship as their main method essentially for worship. So we see it in Catholicism, within Orthodoxy, and within Church of England. Now, Christians who prefer liturgical worship believe that the repetition causes them to be better acquainted with the biblical passages, and so therefore have a closer connection with God. So they believe that, as you would probably imagine, if you repeat the same biblical passages when you do each of the same kinds of worships or each similar kinds of services, and as you get used to repeating these biblical passages, you grow and have a greater connection to these biblical passages because you are understanding them in more detail. You may be reading into things that you didn't read into when you did the service previously. And therefore you get a closer relationship with God, because considering the fact that we have the closest relationship with God, according to a number of believers, when we are reading things like the Bible and when we're reading things like biblical passages and biblical texts. Now, different liturgies will be celebrated during different parts of the year, so it's not like the congregation will do the exact same service every single week. They will do different services, but that when you do the same service twice, you will perform the same actions. You'll perform the same kind of things, and it will be structured in the same kind of way. So there'll be services that are celebrated at one time of the year, another times of the year, and this does sort of link quite tangentially to the idea of celebrations, which we will look at in a future lesson. So you'll do particular services during, for example, during Lent, for Easter, around Christmas time, etc., etc. And so these different things will give a very structured meaning to the different services throughout the calendar year. In addition to liturgical services or liturgical worship, you also have non-liturgical worship. And this is, as you can imagine, unlike liturgical worship. It is a form of worship that is far more spontaneous. It is often not necessarily pre-planned in any meaningful way. There might be some pre-planning in terms of the general structure that's taking place, but it is nowhere near as rigid and structured as a liturgical service would be. And oftentimes a minister will just simply lead a service and will call upon members to get involved in the service whenever they see fit, whenever it seems necessary to do so. So it's almost like a little bit of improv within a particular service system. So it's more like a jazz form of service rather than the more rigid liturgical types of worship. Now, this may be through picking their own passages to read, or maybe sermons, or maybe hymns to sing. So you may get a situation where there is no pre-planning at all, and the minister will just pick on people within the particular congregation to read whatever passage they want to read, or maybe to choose the hymns that they want to sing. And so therefore you get a very different sense of worship when we're talking about this compared to the more rigid liturgical system. And so it is most common within Protestant, Baptist, and also a number of Presbyterian churches. So it is not necessarily the norm within the broader denominations of Christianity. This is not to suggest that there are no non-liturgical types of worship that exist within Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and etc., etc. Just that it's an increasingly rare, and it's not the common form of worship that takes place within those congregations. And so if we look into Protestant and Baptist and Presbyterian churches, you see that this is heavily used as the more common type of worship that takes place. And again, equally, it is the case that it's not necessarily the case that within these particular denominations that they don't refer to any liturgical worship system, but just that they would opt for the non-liturgical system rather than the liturgical system. And so while the purpose of worship is the same across both of these different types of practice, they are very different in their implementation. So we can see really a major distinction between these two kinds of worship. And then there are also some what I would describe as subsidiary kinds of worship. So, for example, this charismatic worship. And this is an alternative form of worship, and it is drawn from a very specific part of the Bible, from the biblical text. It's drawn specifically from Acts. And they say in this that when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. This particular passage gives rise to a type of worship that exists that we call charismatic worship. And the idea here that is presented within Acts is that the Holy Spirit came to the apostles on the day of Pentecost and gave them gifts. And so therefore through charismatic worship, and it is believed that you can actually have the Holy Spirit come again to provide more gifts, as they do in Acts here. And so therefore, it's believed that through the practice of charismatic worship, people will be blessed with the ability to speak in tongues, sometimes through prophecy as well, and also do great acts of healing. So it is believed that through charismatic worship, you can do things that the Holy Spirit allows you to be able to do. And the worship itself is not organized and doesn't follow any particular pattern in any way. If you remember, if you look back to the passage from Acts, there's no definitive guide or instruction manual for how to actually perform this type of worship, but instead it is marked often with a lot of loud singing, loud dancing, and is also as seen as a way to allow people to open themselves up to the Holy Spirit, to allow the Holy Spirit to enter and give these gifts, to allow them to speak in tongues, to allow them to become prophets and to do incredible acts of healing. Now, we often see charismatic worship practiced mostly within Pentecostal churches. Finally, let's talk about the importance of individual worship. This is only a little bit that we can add on the end, and this isn't necessarily in any meaningful sense different to the types of worship that you can do within a congregation. Individual worship will also follow prayer. It will also follow private readings of biblical texts, and so therefore you see that there is some similarities between the congregational types of worship and individual worships in terms of some of the things that you do. You may even want to do hymns on your own if you want, but there is a certain significance that exists within individual worship. Worshipping in private is also a way for individuals to come closer to a relationship with God. It is often linked with the idea of prayer, and we will actually look at prayer in a future lesson and the importance of individual prayer and private prayer when it comes to the broader Christian doctrine.